We export the second most amount of fossil fuels behind Russia in the world. So it's Russia first and Australia second. And the biggest customer of our coal and gas is
네, 여러분 안녕하세요. 제로에너지바입니다. 여러분 호주 하면은 뭐가 떠오르세요? 캥거루? 코알라? 우리 한국인들이 보통 이제 호주로 여행 많이 가시고 또 이제 젊은 분들은 워킹홀리데이 가고 하는데 사실 이제 그런 거 말고는 호주에 대해 좀 아는 게 별로 많지는 않은 것 같습니다. 특히나 어떤 경제적으로 우리가 이렇게 두 나라가 긴밀히 엮여 있다는 것 모르시는 분들 많을 것 같아요. 그런데 우리나라한테 호주는 이제 10손가락 안에 드는 교역 상대국이고요. 그리고 호주 입장에서 한국은 무려 5손가락 안에 드는 또 그런 파트너입니다. 그리고 이제 지난 2월 달에 우리 그린 수소 얘기할 때도 언급이 됐지만 어떤 이제 에너지 전환이라든가 이런 분야에 있어서도 두 나라가 협력해야 될 분야가 굉장히 많습니다. 그래서 오늘 호주 전문가 두 분을 모셨습니다. 호주 녹색당 대표의 그 기후정책보좌관인 Tilley님 그리고 작년 이맘때 제로에너지바에 나오셨어요. 찾아보시죠. 네, 파란 클라이멧의 송혜나 대표입니다. 안녕하세요.
안녕하세요.
Thank you for being my guest. And would you briefly introduce yourselves to our viewers?
Sure. I'm Tilley. I work on climate issues in Australia, and it's brought me to Japan and Korea because this is where most of our coal and gas goes to. So if we're going to solve the climate crisis, we've got to solve the trading relationship and create a new trading relationship between Australia and Japan and Korea. So that's why I'm here.
Okay.
My name is Anna Song. I'm a Korean Australian now based in Seoul, South Korea, running my own climate economy consultancy called Paran Climate. And this is my second time on this channel. And things have changed since then. So I'm very glad to be asked back.
Okay. So is it your first time to Korea?
It is, yes.
How is it? How do you
It's
like?
very cool. I actually really like it. I don't like the cold, but I like the food and I like the people. So yeah.
I actually ask you to briefly touch on upcoming political events. Would you please talk more about that?
Yeah, sure. So there's an election coming up in Australia about the same time that you're probably going to have a presidential election. So sometime between March and May. And it's going to be an important one because the Conservative Party has been in power for a very long time. They were kicked out in 2022. But with inflation making life really hard for governments, people are frustrated that they're losing their spending power. They are voting against incumbent governments. We saw that around the world. And so the question is, will Australia do the same thing? For the climate, it would be absolutely dreadful if the Conservatives got back in because they are more or less comprised of people who do not believe that the climate is changing from coal and gas and oil that we're burning. But that's where we are, so that's why it's going to be a really important election.
틸리님께서 오신 이유도 사실 이제 그것과 관련이 있다고 합니다. 근데 사실 우리가 호주 정치 체계에 대해서 잘 모르는 분들이 많잖아요. 그래서 그거를 제가 아주 짧게 설명을 하고 그다음에 이제 본격적인 질문으로 넘어가는 게 좋을 것 같습니다. 먼저 호주 정치는 영국이랑 좀 비슷하다라고 생각하시면 좋을 것 같아요. 일단 의원 내각제 국가고요. 그리고 상원과 하원이 있는 양원제 국가입니다. 근데 그 둘 중에서는 약간 하원이 좀 더 실권을 갖고 있는 것 같아요. 그러니까 3년마다 총선이 열리는데 하원 다수당의 대표가 보통 호주 총리가 됩니다. 네, 뭐 여기까지 뭐 틀린 부분이 없죠?
잘하고 계세요.
네, 나중에 이제 정정을 해주시고 있으면 지금 현재 총리는 지난 2022년 총선에서 이제 다수당이 된 노동당의 앤서니 알바니즈가 이제 총리를 맡고 있고요. 그때가 무려 9년 만에 정권 교체였다고 해요. 그런데 이제 그때 이제 우리나라에서 화제가 됐던 거는 2022년 호주 총선이 기후 선거였다 이렇게 알려져 있습니다. 그리고 작년에 그 송 대표님이 나오셨을 때도 기후 선거, 호주가 이렇게 기후 선거를 치렀어요, 막 이렇게 했단 말이죠. 그런데 이제 3년이 지나서 다시 총선을 앞두고 있는데 총선 날짜, is the election date decided?
No.
It hasn't been officially called. However, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the news outlet, has predicted either end of March or early April as the very likely election.
Anyway, it's spring. 어쨌든 봄에 이제 총선을 앞두고 있는데 최근에 나오는 지지율을 보면 노동당이 또 이제 정권을 잃을 좀 그럴 위기에 좀 처해 있는 것 같아요. 중도 우파 성향의 자유국민연합이 좀 다소 우세한 걸로 나타나거든요. 그런데 어쨌든 양쪽 다 지금 그 보수 성향이건 아니면 지금 현재 노동당이건 양쪽 다 어디 혼자 단독으로 과반을 차지하기는 좀 어려워 보여서 여기 이제 틸리님께서 속해 계신 녹색당의 역할이 굉장히 중요해 보인다 이렇게 보이는데 예, 저의 정리가 어떤가요?
Yep, I mean, the Australian Greens hold the balance of power in the Senate, which means if the climate deniers oppose something, then we're in the balance of power. We choose whether it passes or it fails. And so that balance of numbers in the Senate, after this election, it could be in the House as well. So we would be influential in both houses, and it's a great opportunity for serious action on the climate and transitioning Australia's exports and trade with Korea in particular. Yeah.
So you grabbed the casting votes? Can I say that?
Yes, I mean, yes. So the government's numbers and the Greens numbers together with one or two others is enough to pass laws. Or yes. So if the opposition and the government, they could pass a law too, but that doesn't happen very often. So we're often in the box seat of deciding laws. Yeah.
I'll just add, if you don't mind,
yes.
That given some forecasts that have come out last week by YouGov polling and so forth, especially in the lower house. In the House, I think the balance of power, the kingmaker role, may also be carried out by some of the independents, including the Climate 200 sort of independent candidates. So I think this is a popcorn, sort of get your popcorn and get ready to watch sort of election from some of the evidence I can see. But yeah, definitely, I think in the Senate, the Greens have potentially a greater power over legislation coming up than the House. But we'll have to see.
We will. It'll be an interesting one. So yeah, the government could rely on the teal independents, the climate independents, but they might not support the government because they represent parts of the country that have always voted for the Conservatives. So they may feel that they should back the Conservatives. So it's unclear what they'll do if that happens.
You keep mentioning Senate, but does the Senate actually mean something? Because I thought Senate, they don't actually have a power.
Well, yeah, so in the House of Representatives, that's where government is formed. Whoever gets the majority forms government there. So that's where this new dynamic might happen. But in the Senate, that's about passing laws. The government can't pass a law that they want unless they get the Senate to agree.
So this would be a point of difference for the Korean audience. So it's quite a different system where the lower house in the federal parliament, whoever can form a majority on its own or in coalition of others as a minority government, they will become the government. So prime minister and ministers will be formed by them. But if the federal government wants to pass any laws, it will have to go through both House and the Senate.
Okay. So since you are working for the Green Party, so I want to ask this. Over the past 3 years, what key legislation has the Greens prioritized?
Well, our priorities over the last 3 years have been around climate, economic inequality and housing is a big issue in Australia. Cost of rents went up massively in the last 3 years. The cost of buying a house is just impossible unless your parents own a house. So those three issues were the issues that we were most focused on changing. And so we got really good outcomes, more money into housing, more public housing being built. We've got a lot of hits against the gas industry in Australia, which is a very powerful industry, but we've been particularly focused on doing things that reins back this idea that Korea needs all this gas and Japan needs all this gas when they don't, and it threatens our entire planet as well. Not just what Japan and Korea and Australia is doing, it's bigger than that. But we are a big part of it. You know, we export the second most amount of fossil fuels behind Russia in the world. So it's Russia first and Australia second. And the biggest customer of our coal and gas is Japan, followed by China, followed by Korea. So it's a really important region and a really important trading relationship. So taking on those big issues are really difficult, but we're forcing conversations within government and across in broader public debate as well. So it takes time, but it's important work. So, yeah.
Yeah, just like you said, your economy is highly reliant on fossil fuels like coal and gas. So that's why both Korea and Australia were once called climate villain. So, well, of course, the Greens prioritized green transition. But my question is how important the general public and businesses or politicians consider it to be?
It's a good question. I think the public, young people in particular, really care. They've seen what future looks like. We have massive heat waves, we have fires, we have floods that destroy property. We've seen all these in the last 5 years in Australia. It focuses our mind. So I think for younger people particularly, it's really important. In business, I think everyone understands the general direction of travel, that we are going to change, but some businesses that make a lot of money out of the old system want to keep that old system. So there's a lot of struggle between, but I think we all know where we're heading, and it's now fighting over how quickly we get there. Yeah.
So Anna, do you want to add something?
I feel tempted just to give a more fuller picture, perhaps. Sure. I think adding on from what you're saying, in Australian economy, the inner cities of Melbourne or Sydney is slightly a different economy to especially some of the regions of Queensland and Western Australia, where coal and gas is still seen as the big provider of jobs for those communities. And while it's really important we bring that transition and give good high-paying jobs to those communities so they can see for themselves that the green transition is good for everybody as well as the planet. I do sense that especially the presence of gas between this bilateral relationship of Australia and Korea, I think it will be a longer transition period than what some of the advocates say in the narrative. And I hope the narrative pushes businesses and governments to accelerate that transition out of gas. But in the meantime, especially with the international gas market impacted by the conflict in Ukraine and so forth, we also need to look at the evidence, look at what the market activities and its impacts in local Australian economy is doing, and really create demand side so that people have a solution once they do phase out of fossil fuels.
우리나라 같은 경우는 석탄 발전소의 대부분이 충남에 몰려 있고, 그래서 충남 같은 경우는 그 도 차원에서도 이 전환에 대한 되게 이제 우리가 뭘 그럼 준비를 해야 되는지에 대한 얘기가 꾸준히 나오는 걸로 아는데, 그러면 서호주나 이런 데는 좀 그렇진 않은 건가요? 계속 그걸 뭔가 저항하려는 그게 더 강한 건지.
There definitely is an acknowledgement that Australia needs to phase out of gas and embrace green hydrogen and renewable energy as its economic future more broadly. But if you speak to the specific people who are impacted by the gas industry, I think you'll hear some different views. And when I was in Australia just a couple of weeks ago, what was quite significant, I think, was Queensland state government and South Australian state governments publicly announced they're pulling back some of the government funding for green hydrogen projects in Australia. So I think when the market and government support for sort of milestone flagship projects for green hydrogen, which creates a demand to phase out of fossil fuel, including gas, that sort of makes people a bit nervous about the transition and sends not so much a confident signal. So I think those things need to be worked on with market proponents more actively.
Well, let's move on to another question. If Biden had the IRA then your Albanese government has a future made in Australia. That's right. Okay. So that includes tax incentives totaling 13.7 billion Australian dollars to support green hydrogen production and critical mineral processing. I think both IRA and future made in Australia seem well aligned with green transition. But the thing is, they don't seem to be winning over voters. So what do you think that is?
I don't think they've had a chance to prosecute it yet. So you might see it over the election cycle, particularly in Western Australia, where the Labor government won a lot of seats off the Conservatives. And so the Conservatives voted against that legislation, even though the prime beneficiaries of that legislation will be Western Australia. It'll create the next generation of investment in forward-looking mining, away from gas and coal, but still using iron ore, critical minerals, and creating jobs. So historically, Australia's just been an exporter of bulk commodities. We've just exported the raw things. What we're trying to do is create value in Australia, build new industries in Australia, and overcome some of those technical challenges that we might have, particularly in Korea with large steel production, that if we can export the hydrogen as a chemical, we can export it as ammonia, we could export it as green iron, and those businesses in Korea can invest in Australia and make the changes here. They can control the same thing, and the Australian government will support that financially. So you could have Korean businesses or Japanese businesses just shifting where production happens, but the same trading routes are happening in a different way of just buying gas and buying coal.
Let me just give maybe some of the specifics of what happened on the Future Made in Australia agenda. Because when I was in Australia just a couple of weeks ago, it was really exciting because the hydrogen tax incentive passed both the House and the Senate. So the hydrogen production tax incentive is if the $2 per kilogram of renewable hydrogen is produced between 2027 to 2028, for up to 10 years maximum per project, they can get that tax incentive paid by the federal government of Australia. And also passed was the critical minerals production tax incentive, which is worth 10% of relevant processing and refining costs for Australia's designated 31, so critical minerals. So these can be quite significant cost-saving initiatives as a driver for exactly sort of what Jay was talking about, of the trading partners in Asia, of Korea, Japan, wanting to do production on Australian soil. However, I think the catch is that tax incentives only kick in when there is actually a running project on the ground. So, the timing of from 2027 and the fact that investment actually has to, be really meaningful for the local Australian economy. I think there's still a couple of hurdles in the market to find an investor who's willing to put up sort of billions of dollars in order to make that happen. But I think it's really promising. And in the next couple of years, I hope this sends a signal for Asian investors to look at Australia more seriously as a hydrogen producing country. But I don't know if Jay has sort of felt, while being in country in Korea, do you think Koreans know about Future Made in Australia and the hydrogen incentive tax?
No, I mean, I can't speak for everyone, obviously, or businesses, but I think there's not only do they have to sell it politically in Australia to voters, but they also need to sell it to big companies like POSCO. There's a real opportunity here for us to shift away from coal and gas and towards new trading relationships.
So I hope the Australian government gets on like a PR.
I'm sure they will. I'm sure they will.
Do some advertising campaigns about how this tax incentive is now up and running.
They could be doing it as we speak. Who knows? I'm not sure.
Let's hope so.